It was a fleeting look, almost impossible to catch, gone in an instant. Yet it was enough to make Alejandro shiver. It wasn't a smile, not even surprise, but it was the first sign that something was breaking through the shell. Nico didn't notice. He was lost in the dance. He combined a slow spin with a small jump. Not high like on the street, but restrained, because here movements needed to be whispers, not shouts. He dropped low to the ground, pressed a hand to the carpet, and slid one leg beneath his body as if drawing a flower in an invisible field. Then he rose and spread his arms, marking a beat that seemed to pulse. The music faded, softer and softer. At the end, Nico stopped in front of Valeria and lowered his gaze. Not as submission, but as a silent invitation for her to choose whether to respond. The speaker clicked off. Silence returned, heavier than before. None of the adults moved. Valeria blinked again. Her eyes rested for a moment on the boy's face. She said nothing, but when he stepped back slowly toward the door, she followed him with her gaze until he was gone. Alejandro, who had barely dared to breathe, couldn't hold back a small tear. It was a tiny gesture, yes, but it was the first time in months he had seen his daughter react to something other than the view outside her window. Nico shut off the speaker, slipped it into his backpack, and waited. He asked for nothing. He didn't know that behind the door, the staff had traded their whispers of suspicion for silent questions. What if this worked? What if this poverty carried something money couldn't buy? Alejandro leaned down to his daughter's level. "Did you like it?" he whispered. Valeria kept her eyes on the spot where Nico had stood. Her lips didn't move, but her gaze was no longer lost in the garden. It was fixed on the doorway. And that simple shift was enough to make her father's heart beat with new strength. The butler, seeing the scene, cleared his throat lightly, a signal that, even if he didn't fully understand, he was ready to give it a chance. The nurse closed the notebook where she had written down vital signs and smiled faintly. Nico, unaware of the weight of what he had done, simply waited for instructions. "You'll come back tomorrow," Alejandro said, with a conviction that surprised everyone. "And the day after. And for as long as it takes." Nico nodded. He wasn't sure if he had the right to enter this palace again, but the man's sincerity left no room for doubt. He walked out with measured steps, leaving behind a different silence. Not the dead calm from before, but an expectation that vibrated in the air. Days passed, and true to his word, Alejandro had the gates of his mansion opened every afternoon for the street boy. Nico always arrived at the same time, carrying his speaker under one arm and wearing the same worn-out sneakers that had become part of his identity. At each visit, he walked through marble halls without looking at the golden portraits or the staff's judging stares. His eyes were fixed on only one person, Valeria. At first, his dances were quiet and delicate, as if he feared breaking more than just the stillness of the room. But as the days went on, he began to let himself flow with the music from his speaker, adding small variations. He didn't try to impress or perform flashy tricks. He danced as he had promised from the start, truly with his heart, offering each step as a gift that asked for nothing in return. Valeria remained motionless, her hands resting on her lap. Yet something in her began to change. Each time Nico finished a routine, her eyes took 1 second longer before returning to the window. Sometimes she blinked differently, like someone processing something new. One afternoon, when the boy spun gently in front of her and extended his arm, the girl's fingers moved almost imperceptibly, a tiny contraction that, in another setting, would have gone unnoticed. Alejandro, watching closely, felt a tremor of emotion. The movement lasted less than a breath, but it was real. The mansion staff began paying more attention. The chef peeked through the door when she heard music. The gardener, passing by, stopped in silence, resting his gloves on his waist to watch for a moment. The butler, who had first frowned at Nico, now studied each gesture with less judgment and more curiosity. The poverty that had triggered alarms was slowly turning into a welcomed presence. Some whispered, "Could this be a miracle?" Others avoided the word, but all agreed that something shifted in the air whenever Nico danced. Alejandro stayed home more often. He delegated meetings, postponed signings, sent assistants with excuses no one dared to question. His time seemed frozen in his daughter's room, synchronized with the rhythm of the little dancer. He didn't speak much. He only watched, breathed, and sometimes allowed himself the small smiles that once seemed impossible. Nico, for his part, discovered something new in that space. On the street, his dance was both currency and refuge, a mix of survival and art. In the mansion, his dance became a silent conversation with a girl who did not respond with words, but who, little by little, seemed to listen. He began adding softer movements, gentle sways like a lullaby, small taps of his heels that marked a faint beat. It was as if the rhythm caressed Valeria's absence, filling the void with something like hope. One afternoon, after finishing a piece, Nico dared to speak. "Hi," he whispered, barely audible. "I don't know your name, but I'm glad to see you." It was the first time the words of the street entered that room. Valeria didn't answer, but her eyes searched for the voice, moved across the boy's face, then returned to the window. Alejandro watched in silence, not interrupting. Maybe it wasn't time for answers yet, but it was time for constant presence. The dance remained a bridge. With each visit, the boy brought not only music, but also a bit of the outside world the Santori home had always avoided. He brought the smell of asphalt, the noise of engines, the distant laughter of children playing in plazas, all transformed into steps telling simple stories. How a person can still find a reason to move, even in hardship. Little by little, the staff stopped calling Nico the street boy and began using his name. The nurse recorded Valeria's small movements in her notebook, counting them as progress. The butler, though still watchful, started to understand that threats do not always come from poverty, but from prejudice. In this atmosphere of subtle change, Alejandro allowed himself to dream of something science had not promised him. He knew doctors still said his daughter's condition was irreversible, but he also knew life had placed at his door an opportunity not found in any prescription. A boy who danced without promises, only presence, inventing a language that judged no one and, without meaning to, caressed an absence. That mix of humility and perseverance was embedding itself deeper into the heart of the mansion. At the mansion, the afternoons began to take on a new rhythm. Every day at 4, Nico arrived and filled Valeria's room with movement and music. Alejandro, who was used to the strict schedules of meetings and contracts, began to organize his life around that hour. But even though the change was clear to him and to those working in the house, not everyone was convinced. One morning, Alejandro decided to speak with the doctor in charge of his daughter's rehabilitation. He had consulted many specialists. All had given him harsh diagnoses. Dr. Herrera, a well-known neurologist, received him in his private office, surrounded by diplomas and awards. He listened carefully to what Alejandro had to say. "Doctor, there's something I want to show you," the magnate said, pulling out his phone. "My daughter has been reacting differently." He played a short video of Valeria following Nico with her eyes. The doctor studied the screen without blinking, analyzing every detail of the girl's face. When the video ended, he stayed quiet for a few seconds. "I understand that this gives you hope," he finally said. "But don't fool yourself. The damage to your daughter's spinal cord is irreversible according to the science we know. What you see could be an involuntary reflex. I don't want you to lose your mind with false illusions." The words hit Alejandro hard. He had heard this speech many times, yet something inside him had changed. He no longer accepted these answers with the same resignation. "I know what the reports say, doctor, but this is different." She looks at him. Her hand moves. Muscles can react to sensory stimuli without any conscious process, Herrera insisted. You must be realistic. I don't want you or your daughter to suffer more when this doesn't progress. The conversation left a bitter taste. Alejandro left the office with a mix of anger and guilt. He scolded himself for getting his hopes up, but also rebelled against the idea of giving up. He remembered Valeria's face as she followed Nico. Even if it was only a reflex, wasn't it worth giving her a little joy while it lasted? He walked to his car with his head full of questions. Was it irresponsible to insist on something doctors denied? Was he exploiting the boy's hope for his own desire? At the mansion, the staff watched cautiously. The older ones whispered that they had never seen Alejandro so vulnerable. The nurse caring for Valeria noticed the girl responded better to stimuli each day. The record showed small changes. Her heart rate shifted when Nico danced. Her breathing grew deeper. But she didn't dare argue against the doctor's authority. That same afternoon, when the clock struck 4, Nico arrived as usual. Alejandro greeted him with a gesture that tried to hide the weight of his earlier talk with the neurologist. Today, just dance as always, he said. Don't worry about anything else. Nico nodded, knowing nothing of doctors or diagnoses. He turned on the speaker and began a routine of fluid movements and precise pauses. In the middle of a spin, the door opened softly. It was Dr. Herrera, who had decided to see for himself what was happening. Alejandro had invited him that morning, hoping to convince him. The neurologist stood aside, taking mental notes. Nico wasn't intimidated. He kept dancing, ignoring the presence of the man in the white coat with the critical gaze. Valeria, feeling the music, once again turned her eyes toward the boy. Her fingers twitched in a faint tremor, barely a breath of movement. The doctor's eyes widened in surprise, and he stepped closer. After a few minutes, the music was turned off. Did you see that? Alejandro asked, his voice full of emotion. I saw what you showed me, the doctor said carefully. It's true there is motor response, but it's still not proof of neuronal recovery. However, he paused. I must admit that the auditory and visual stimulation seems to activate areas we thought were inactive. It could be useful as complementary therapy to improve her emotional well-being, even if it won't change the diagnosis. It was the closest thing to approval Alejandro had heard in months, and even though it wasn't a promise of recovery, it was enough to strengthen his decision. Nico would keep coming, with or without medical endorsement. His daughter's well-being was worth it. The guilt still lingered. Alejandro wondered if he was forcing Valeria to interact with a stranger. He also thought of Nico. What would happen when this was over? Could he offer him a better future? Doubts lived side by side with hope. It was new, ambiguous ground, where he had to navigate without the maps of business success. The next day, Alejandro gathered his staff. He explained that the boy's presence was now a permanent decision. He asked for respect and support. Some agreed immediately, others reluctantly. But no one opposed him. They had seen Valeria's fingers move. They had seen the spark in their boss's eyes. And for the first time, they accepted that maybe, just maybe, science did not have all the answers. Alejandro's decision to have Nico return every afternoon did not remain just words. After the neurologist's visit and the evidence of small changes in Valeria, the magnate knew he had to secure the continuity of the ritual. The next day, he called Nico before he arrived and invited him to have breakfast with him in the mansion's kitchen. It was a less ostentatious space than the main dining hall, but it was full of exquisite aromas and elegant dishes. Nico, used to eating stale bread or nothing at all, stared wide-eyed at the table. Fluffy eggs, freshly squeezed orange juice, fruit cut into perfect cubes. Alejandro sat across from him, dressed in his flawless suit, wearing a serious expression. I want to talk with you, he said. I know you've been coming every afternoon. I want you to keep doing it. But I also want to make sure you don't go hungry or cold while you do. Nico blinked, confused. He wasn't used to anyone worrying about his basic needs. On the street, everything was immediate. Food, shelter, coins. The idea of having a safe place seemed almost like a dream. I don't need anything, he said at first instinctively. I dance because I want to, but in his voice there was a tone of honesty. Life had taught him to be wary. Alejandro shook his head. It's not just about dancing. I want you to eat here. To rest if you need to. My house has many empty rooms. You can use one to sleep when it's cold, or when you need a roof. It's not charity. He paused. It's an exchange. You give us something valuable, something no one else can give Valeria. I want to give you something in return to make your life a bit easier. Do you accept? The boy looked down at his hands, trembling and dirty despite the quick wash before coming in. It was tempting. Nights on the street could be cruel, with their threatening noises and biting cold. Accepting meant no more sleeping on benches or in dark doorways. But at what cost? He chewed on the thought while taking a piece of bread to his mouth. I accept, he finally said softly, but only if I can still be myself. I don't want people to see me differently just because I now walk through a big door. And, he added, staring straight at Alejandro, I don't want the girl to think I dance because you're paying me. I dance because I feel it. I don't want that to change. Alejandro smiled with an honesty he rarely showed in public. I don't want to change you. I want to help you. And as for my daughter, I want her to keep believing you dance because you want to make her feel good. Because that's the truth. From that day on, a pact without contracts, small print, or signatures was sealed with a handshake. Alejandro gave Nico a small room near the kitchen, away from the main halls. It was simple. A clean bed, a wardrobe, a window looking out to the back garden. The boy looked at it in awe. He hadn't seen a mattress like that in years. A soft sheet, a fluffy pillow, a safe roof. It was like an oasis. The staff reacted with murmurs of opinion. Some saw it as extravagance, others as madness. But most, having already felt the effect of Nico's dancing on Valeria, began to see the boy as someone deserving of support. The cook prepared hot meals for him and invited him to sit at the small table used by the staff. The gardener taught him how to care for plants in his free time. Even the butler, the strictest of all, softened and explained how to use linen towels without ruining them. Nico, timid at first, began to open up. In the afternoons, after dancing, he stayed to talk with some of the workers. He told them about life on the street, about friends who slept in parks, about how he had learned to dance by watching other kids on internet videos from store windows. He spoke of fears and hopes, not realizing he was slowly becoming part of an improvised family. Meanwhile, Alejandro felt that his house was no longer just a museum of memories. With Nico's presence, the halls filled with laughter, improvised music, shoes marked with garden dirt. Valeria still did not speak, but her gaze grew more alive. Sometimes, when the boy walked past her at the end of a dance and bowed respectfully, the girl seemed to understand. Her eyes followed him. Her breathing matched the rhythm she had just heard. It was as if, even without moving, her spirit went for a walk every afternoon alongside Nico's steps. One of those afternoons, after Nico had danced and eaten, he stayed in Valeria's room while Alejandro spoke with her. The father stroked his daughter's hand and told her stories of places he had visited. Nico listened quietly. At one point, Alejandro turned to him. "Tell her something about you," he asked. "It doesn't have to be about the street if you don't want. Something you like, a story." Nico was surprised. He wasn't used to anyone wanting to hear him. He smiled shyly and began to share a dream. One day, He wanted to be part of a professional dance group. He spoke with bright eyes, as if in his mind the street became a stage with lights and applause. Valeria watched him closely. She didn't speak, but the room filled with a new energy, the energy of a shared dream. Alejandro listened in silence, nodding, knowing that this boy was not only helping his daughter, but teaching him to see beyond contracts and deals. For the first time in his life, an agreement without papers was the most valuable one he had ever signed. The afternoons continued with the same peaceful routine. Nico arrived, danced, ate, and went to rest. As the days passed, something wonderful began to happen. The silence that once filled Valeria's room started to overflow with small sounds only attentive hearts could notice. They were light sighs, deep breaths, inhalations that matched the improvised music. No one spoke of it aloud for fear of breaking the spell, but everyone noticed the girl was more present, more connected to the moment. Nico, who was used to dancing in empty halls filled with cars and lifeless conversations, discovered a new stage in that room. It was no longer just about moving himself. It was about translating what he felt into gestures that could be read by someone who could not move. He began to watch Valeria's eyes more carefully. Each time her pupils widened or shrank at a movement, he took mental notes. If she liked the soft circles, he repeated them. If she blinked at the rhythm of his heel taps, he brought them back. It was a choreography of tenderness, where steps born on the street were refined in a room that, little by little, seemed to open to life. One day, while repeating a slow arm movement to a soft melody, Nico noticed something. Valeria's little finger lifted almost imperceptibly at the exact moment he marked the beat. He froze, looked at the girl, and tapped his foot again. She responded by moving the finger once more. It was the first time they established a real dialogue, not a conversation in words, but a language of their own that they were creating together. Alejandro, watching from the corner, felt a new emotion burst inside his chest. He realized that music and dance were not only bringing joy to Valeria, but also building a bridge between two worlds. The businessman walked up to his daughter's chair, took her hand, and counted aloud with Nico, marking the beats with his palm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. At first, the girl did not react visibly, but her eyes followed her father's hand and the boy's movement. After several tries, her little finger rose again on the count of 8, and the room exploded into a silence full of smiles. It was a tiny step, but to them it meant more than any figure in the medical reports. The staff began to take part in the new routine. The nurse, instead of staying by the door recording vital signs, entered and counted softly with the others. The gardener clapped his thighs in rhythm while pretending not to. The cook hummed traditional tunes, and Nico wove them into his movements. Even the butler, always so formal, allowed himself a small approving gesture at the end of each session. Without realizing it, they were all learning to count heartbeats in 8 counts. Valeria, for her part, began to show small changes beyond the tiny movements. Her eyes no longer stayed fixed on the window, but focused on what happened in the room. Her cheeks seemed to regain a bit of color. One rainy afternoon, when the light was dim, Nico decided to dance without music. His sneakers hit the carpet with a dry rhythm. Alejandro, without saying a word, started clapping along to the beat. The girl followed each sound with her eyes, and when the dance ended, a spark of curiosity shone in her gaze. She could not smile, but her lips trembled slightly, as if trying to remember how. These moments were carefully recorded by the nurse, who began comparing her notes with those of earlier days. She saw that Valeria's heart rate rose during the dances and returned to normal afterward, but always stayed a little higher than before she had met Nico. They were signs of emotional and physical stimulation that the neurologist could not ignore. One day, Nico brought wooden sticks he had found in the kitchen. He handed them to Alejandro and asked him to mark the beat together. At first, The idea seemed ridiculous to a businessman used to leading board meetings. But after a short hesitation, the magnate took the sticks and began to tap them. The sound echoed strongly through the room, and Valeria blinked to the rhythm. Then, in a moment of courage, Alejandro asked the nurse to put down her notebook and join them. She smiled and agreed. The room filled with rhythmic sounds. They all marked the beat together, and Nico danced guided by the improvised rhythm. It was the choreography of a family built without blood ties. And so, between wooden sticks, counts, and gentle turns, a language of their own was woven. Everyone learned to read in Valeria's eyes, to mark beats with their hands that went beyond the hours of a clock. For Nico, that room became a stage where he didn't just dance to be seen, but to connect. For Alejandro, rhythm became the purest way to reach his daughter. For Valeria, the beats were a doorway back to the world she thought she had lost. And for the staff, the choreography of tenderness became as vital a routine as polishing marble or watering roses. Before we continue this journey full of emotions and hope, I invite you to support this project. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and give this video a like. That way, you can join us in every chapter and never miss how this story keeps transforming lives. Now then, let's continue with the story. The mansion buzzed with new energy thanks to Nico's presence and Valeria's progress. Yet outside its walls, the world kept turning and watching. News that Alejandro Santori had taken in a street boy began to spread little by little. At first, they were whispers in social circles. A rumor told in an exclusive club, a conversation between wives in a luxury salon. With time, the rumor turned into headlines. Who is the boy living in the magnate's mansion? Santori's mysterious guest stirs up shareholders. Charity or extravagance? The media soon knocked on the door of the Santori company. A journalist from a financial magazine dared to ask at a press conference, "Mr. Santori, is it true you have a homeless boy living in your home? Don't you fear for your safety and that of your daughter?" The question, though polite, carried judgment. Alejandro answered with a serious gesture. "In my house live my family and those I choose. The rest is not public business." His voice left no room for more questions, but curiosity did not vanish. At the next shareholders' meeting, the mood was tense. The men and women, most more concerned with numbers than names, looked at one another, waiting for someone to speak. Finally, one of the veterans, a white-haired man with a calm voice, cleared his throat. "Alejandro," he said, "you've made risky decisions that brought us profits, and we respect that. But this," he paused, weighing his words, "don't you think bringing a stranger from the street into your home is a vulnerability? What will investors say if they see your personal life interfering with our business?" Alejandro leaned forward, resting his hands on the dark wooden table. "What I do in my house is my business," he answered firmly. "My daughter is improving with Nico's presence. That concerns me more than your opinion." "We're not talking about opinions," continued another, younger shareholder. "We're talking about reputation. Shares can fall because of this. There are already rumors you've neglected some projects to stay home. Competitors smell blood." The room filled with nervous murmurs. Alejandro took a deep breath. He knew his life was scrutinized to the smallest detail, and that every decision affected millions of dollars. But he also knew his daughter's happiness was worth more than any number. "If anyone here thinks my being home is a problem for business, they can leave," he said calmly, but with steel in his voice. "I am willing to face the consequences." An uncomfortable silence followed. No one stood. No one gave up their shares. They all knew that despite their words, they depended on the man in front of them. Shame became a ghost in the room. Alejandro remembered his own past, when as a boy he had to fight for space and recognition in a world that didn't believe in him. Looking around, he saw in their faces a reflection of his own old ambition. People who had forgotten why they once worked hard, now ready to judge him for opening his home to a boy with talent. In the days that followed, the headlines continued. Some TV shows tried to interview Alejandro's neighbors, who told exaggerated stories. Tabloids suggested the magnate was compensating for past guilt. Social media split between those praising his humanity and those accusing him of showing off charity. Alejandro did not respond. He had learned outside noise was inevitable. His priority was what happened inside his house. In the mansion, the staff felt the tension. There were quick conversations in the kitchen about the news, but they always stopped when Nico walked in. Valeria, unaware of headlines, kept receiving the boy with her quiet attention. Every afternoon, the rhythms and wooden sticks became a refuge from the noise outside. Nico knew nothing of the controversy. On the street, reputation was a luxury. His world was survival and art. In the house, his only concern was finding the best way to reach Valeria and help her out of her silence. One afternoon, after dancing, Alejandro sat by the fireplace with his hands clasped and Nico at his side. "Have you noticed what people are saying about you?" he asked, curious. Nico shook his head. "I don't have a TV," he shrugged. "People always talk." Alejandro looked at him and smiled with a touch of sadness. "Sometimes the noise outside can be loud, but the only thing that matters is what happens here. Remember that, kid?" Nico nodded. For him, this house was a new world where he could eat hot food, sleep without fear, and dance freely. Approval or criticism outside mattered little. Alejandro was learning from him to value the essential. Dr. Herrera, aware of the controversy, returned to the mansion one afternoon. He joined the circle of wooden sticks and, for the first time, marked the rhythm shyly. At the end, he approached Alejandro. "I don't understand reputations or shares," he said, "but I see a girl who responds and a father who smiles. I believe in medicine, but also in what makes people happy. Maybe I should have seen it sooner." The shame others tried to impose dissolved with those words. Alejandro smiled and nodded. The ghosts of the boardroom would keep speaking, but in the mansion's main hall, the rhythm of the sticks and Nico's steps was the only voice that truly mattered. The mansion, despite the outside pressure, remained a refuge where a different story was being woven. Between dance sessions and shared silences, a moment came that would change the bond between Nico and Alejandro in a deeper way. It happened one night, after an especially emotional session. Valeria had tried to move 2 fingers instead of 1, and the air was filled with hope. Alejandro walked Nico to the kitchen so he could eat before bed. While they had dinner, he realized that even though he knew who the boy was now, he knew almost nothing about his past. "Nico," he began carefully, "I've never asked you about your life before you came here. You don't have to tell me if you don't want, but I'd like to know. How did you end up dancing on that corner?" The boy played with his fork over the plate of pasta for a few seconds. He had avoided that topic for weeks. On the street, every person carries a story heavier than a sack of stones. To share it is to carry it again. He looked Alejandro in the eyes and decided to speak. "I wasn't born in this city," he said softly. "I lived with my mom in a neighborhood where everything was hard. My dad," he paused, searching for words, "left us when I was very little. Mom worked cleaning houses, but the money was never enough. I started dancing after seeing some kids in a plaza. I thought it could help her. I learned fast. People gave me coins. For a while it worked." Alejandro nodded, without interrupting. "But things changed when she got sick," Nico continued. "We had no money for medicine. I tried dancing more, but it wasn't enough. One night, she told me to leave for the city. She said there would be more chances there. She didn't want me to watch her die." His voice shook. "I ran away with some clothes and the speaker. I left her alone. When I came back," His eyes filled with tears. She was gone. The house was empty. I asked around, but no one knew. Since then, the street has been my home. Alejandro felt a knot in his throat. He didn't know what to say. He placed his hand on the table, a silent gesture of support. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I can't imagine what that must have been for you." Nico wiped his tears with the back of his hand and took a breath. "I'm not telling you this for pity," he explained. "I'm saying it because," he glanced around, as if he could see Valeria even though she wasn't there. "Because here I feel safe, and because I think she needs to know where I come from to trust me. I don't want her to see me as a stranger with no story. I've lost too, like her. Not the same way, but I did." Alejandro nodded again. The story woke something in his memory. He remembered his own childhood in a humble neighborhood before becoming the magnate he was. His parents had struggled so he could study. He had worked from a young age to get out. He had sold his memories of games and laughter in exchange for contracts, numbers, and power. He had promised that when he succeeded, he would be happy. And in part, he achieved it, but at a cost: distance from his family, from his roots. He had forgotten what it was like to have nothing but hope. He leaned back in his chair and, for the first time in a long while, spoke about himself without the armor of the businessman. "You know," he began, "my father was a carpenter. My mother sewed to make a living. We were 6 siblings. The house was small, but it was always noisy and full of joy. I wanted more. I saw men in suits and cars and thought, I want to be there. I obsessed over studying and working. I left my people behind to climb the ladder. I made it, but I lost a lot along the way. I made money, but I also caused harm. I thought I had to buy everything. And when Valeria," he stopped to swallow hard. "When Valeria had her accident, I realized there are things money can't fix." Nico listened quietly. Alejandro went on, "I'm not telling this to compare us. I know our stories are different. But now I see we both left something behind to look for something else. You ran away to survive. I ran from my origins to succeed. And maybe, because of that, we met." The boy nodded slowly. "Maybe," he whispered. "Sometimes I think Mom didn't want me to see her go because she wanted me to remember what it was to live, not what it was to die. Dancing keeps me connected to that. And now, with Valeria, I feel like I'm giving something back to someone, even if it isn't her. It's a way to, I don't know, forgive myself for not being there." Alejandro took a deep breath. "I promise that as long as you're here, you'll have a safe place. I want to help you search for your mother, if possible." Nico looked at him, surprised, with a mix of hope and fear. "I don't know if I'll find her," he said. "Maybe she's gone for good. But if we can look, thank you." That night, when they each went to their rooms, the mansion felt different. Nico's confession had tied the two of them together in ways they couldn't imagine. In Valeria's room, the girl slept peacefully, unaware of the story shared, but touched by the new bond between her father and the boy. The past had stepped in, bringing pain and lessons. Alejandro understood he couldn't change what he had done, but he could build a different present. Nico, for his part, felt his story had been heard, and maybe, by telling it to someone who didn't judge him, he had taken a step toward healing. Both realized that trust cannot be bought or sold. It is built with tears, confessions, and mutual support. The day after Nico's confession, the mansion felt charged with contained energy. The stories shared the night before could not be seen, but they were felt in the way Alejandro and the boy now looked at each other with more complicity and respect. There was a bond that did not depend on contracts or promises, but on a mutual understanding of pain and the desire for healing. That afternoon, as always, music filled Valeria's room. Nico had thought of a special rhythm, more marked than other days, as if he wanted to test something he sensed. He began with soft steps, dragging his sneakers across the carpet to make a dull sound. Then he lifted one heel and tapped the floor rhythmically. 1, 2, 3, 4. Alejandro, standing near his daughter, marked each beat with his hands, just as they had practiced days before. The nurse counted silently and noted vital signs. The butler watched from the door with the seriousness of someone secretly allowing himself to be moved. On the 5th tap, something happened. It wasn't a big movement, not a smile, not a cry. It was barely a tremor, like a physical sigh. The index finger of Valeria's left hand lifted slightly. A gesture that for anyone else would be involuntary, but for those in the room, it was a spark that lit everything. She didn't move her head, she didn't turn her eyes. Only that finger responded to the rhythm, like a tiny story inside a vast silence. Nico stopped at once. He looked at Alejandro, who held his breath. The nurse put down her pen and leaned in to check. She whispered Valeria's name and gently touched her hand. At first there was no reaction, but when Nico tapped the floor again, the finger moved once more. The movement was clumsy, slow, but it was a response. Everyone's hearts seemed to stop for a second and then beat stronger. Alejandro knelt in front of his daughter. "Do you feel it?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "If you hear me, move your finger again." Nico watched the girl closely. He tapped his foot once more, marking the beat. Seconds passed like eternity. And then, the index finger rose and fell once again. The gesture was so small that anyone could have mistaken it for a reflex. But for those present, it was a miracle. The father carefully embraced his daughter without moving her, avoiding breaking the moment. Tears fell from his eyes. He smiled and allowed himself to cry as he hadn't since the accident that left her in a wheelchair. "Thank you," he murmured to Nico. "Thank you for not giving up." Nico wiped sweat from his forehead and smiled humbly. He couldn't believe what he was seeing either. It was the first real proof that his dance and the connection he had built with the girl were having a physical effect. He had dreamed of this moment, but seeing it in reality made his chest tighten. The staff, who had heard stories about miracles but had never seen one, broke the silence with soft applause. The nurse quickly wrote the movement in her notes, her eyes shining. The ever-stoic butler placed a hand on his chest, as if to confirm his own heart was still beating. The cook, when she heard, later ran to light a candle in the family's private chapel. After the first wave of emotion, Alejandro called Dr. Herrera. He wanted to share the news. He wanted a professional witness to confirm what they had seen. The doctor arrived that same afternoon. He came in with his usual serious face and asked to repeat the exercise. Nico tapped the floor. Alejandro asked his daughter to move her finger. On the 3rd try, the finger lifted slightly. The neurologist frowned, leaned closer, touched her hand, and slowly nodded. "It's a motor response," he admitted. "We can't yet say anything about recovery, but this means there are active neural connections. It could be a sign of progress." For the first time, the neurologist seemed hopeful. Alejandro smiled. Hope now had a name inside his house. For him, what mattered wasn't a final diagnosis. It was that small tremor that changed everything. Until then, hope had been a fragile word, whispered so as not to sound naive. Now he could say it out loud. The news of the finger movement did not leak outside the mansion. Alejandro wanted to keep it in the family. He didn't need headlines this time. He needed to protect his daughter and Nico from the media storm. Even so, inside the house, the story was told again and again. Each person repeated the scene with the passion of someone recounting history. For them, it was. That night, before leaving, Nico walked up to Valeria and spoke softly, almost a whisper. "Thank you for trusting me," he said. "What happened today is our secret. Tomorrow, we'll keep counting." Valeria didn't answer, but her finger moved slightly, as if sealing the deal. Alejandro saw that gesture and felt that hope, once desperate and fragile, was now real, materialized in the smallest but most powerful of signs. He knew the road ahead was long, that a finger movement did not mean his daughter would walk again. But it was enough to make the world change color. It was a spark that lit up a different future. Valeria's progress remained an intimate secret inside the mansion, yet Nico's presence and the rumor that something special was happening behind the gates could not stay hidden forever. One day, while staff went out to buy supplies, an employee shared a short video with a friend, without bad intention. It showed Nico dancing in the garden, far from Valeria's room, while sunlight filtered through the trees. The friend, touched by the story, uploaded it to social media with the caption, "The boy who dances for Santori's daughter." Within hours, the video was shared thousands of times. The city, already buzzing with curiosity, turned to their screens. People who had never met Valeria or Nico began to comment. Some praised the boy's talent. Others criticized Alejandro for exploiting the story to clean his image.